Welcome to today's lesson. If you want to hear the International Sunday School lesson, it will be linked in the video or in the description or in the comment section. This is the Union Gospel Press version. Today's lesson is for August 23rd, 2020. The title of this lesson is David's Grief for Saul and Jonathan. The scripture text for this lesson is 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 through 12, and then verses 17 through 27. Beginning with verse 11.
David and his men tore their clothes in sorrow when they heard the news. They mourned and wept and fasted all day for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the Lord's army and the nation of Israel, because they had died by the sword that day.
They mourned and wept and fasted all day. David and his men were visibly shaken over Saul's death. Their actions showed their genuine sorrow over their loss of their king, their friend Jonathan, and the other soldiers of Israel who died that day. They were not ashamed to grieve. Today, some people consider expressing emotions to be a sign of weakness. Those who wish to appear strong try to hide their feelings, but expressing our grief can help us deal with our intense sorrow when a loved one dies. Continuing with verse 17.
Then David composed a funeral song for Saul and Jonathan, and he commanded that it be taught to the people of Judah. It is known as the Song of the Bow, and it is recorded in the book of Jasher. Your pride and joy, O Israel, lies dead on the hills. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Don't announce the news in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice and the pagans will laugh in triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fruitful fields producing offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty heroes was defiled. The shield of Saul will no longer be anointed with oil. The bow of Jonathan was powerful, and the sword of Saul did its mighty work. They shed the blood of their enemies, and pierced the bodies of mighty heroes. How beloved and gracious were Saul and Jonathan. They were together in life and in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions.
Reading commentary for verse 17. David was a talented musician. He played the harp, 1 Samuel 16:23. He brought music to worship services of the temple, 1 Chronicles 25. And he wrote many of the Psalms. Here we are told that he wrote a funeral song in memory of Saul and his son Jonathan, David's closest friend. Music played an important role in Israel's history. For other famous songs in the Bible, see the Exodus 15.
For he dressed you in luxurious scarlet clothing, in garments decorated with gold. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies dead on the hills. How I weep for you, my brother Jonathan. Oh, how much I loved you, and your love for me was deep, deeper than the love of women. Oh, how the mighty heroes have fallen. Stripped of their weapons, they lie dead.
Saul had caused much trouble for David, but when he died, David composed a song in memory of the king and his son. David had every reason to hate Saul, but he chose not to. Instead, he chose to look at the good Saul. He chose to look at the good Saul had done and to ignore the times when Saul had attacked him. It takes courage to lay aside hatred and hurt and to respect the positive side of another person, especially an enemy. As somewhat typical in poetry, even inanimate objects such as mountain, dew, rain, and fields are addressed and here called upon to join in weeping. Verse 21. While this may seem somewhat strange to our ears, a close look at some of the poetry found in Christian hymns will reveal that there are many songs that employ similar imagery. The mountains of Gilboa are mentioned specifically because this is where the aforementioned fateful battle took place. As David lamented, he called upon the very forces of nature to withhold their blessings as a sign of grief, so that its landscape mourns in sympathy by becoming dry and unproductive. It was on the field of battle that Saul met his end, although David does not refer to him, but rather to his shield being vilely cast away. The reference to being anointed with oil may have a double meaning. Shields were literally anointed with oil, both to keep them shiny and to help them deflect arrows. Of course, the word anointed also calls to mind the fact that, in spite of his backsliding, Saul was God's anointed king. While we might expect David to extol the battlefield accomplishment of his friend Jonathan, he does so with equal honor concerning Saul. For most of us, it would be difficult to sing the praises of someone who had hated us and tried to murder us. David nevertheless praised Saul. The picture painted by David was one of Saul and Jonathan bravely fighting to the very end. While they were not victorious over the Philistines, they had brought death to their enemies in this final battle. As we know, when people speak of the departed, they often do so in glowing terms, trying to remember the good and forget the bad. Perhaps that is what David was doing in his song of sorrow, thus referring to Saul as lovely and pleasant. Chapter 1, verse 23. While we should not distort the truth about the departed, we are usually better served if we focus on their commendable attributes, not their failures. To be sure, Saul and Jonathan were united in life and death, but for Jonathan, being loyal to his father presented a challenge. David was both his brother in law and his best friend, but also the object of his father's hatred. This created a difficult situation to say the least. Once again extolling their military prowess, David referred to Saul and Jonathan as being swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. While David could have focused on their defeat in battle, he chose instead to glorify their courage. While David hoped that the Philistine women would not even learn of Israel's defeat, he called upon the daughters of Israel to weep over Saul. The references to the women being clothed in scarlet and wearing ornaments of gold probably should not be taken literally, though some certainly may have benefited in this manner. Key points. 1. Christians should mourn the passing of loved ones as well as those they had difficulties with. 2. It is right to mourn the loss of loved ones and former associates, for it shows that we know their value. 3. We should be sure to honor the mourning of others. 4. The loss of great leaders, even flawed ones, is hard to bear. 5. It is good to realize the legacy of those we have lost while we mourn their loss. 6. When we have lost loved ones, we should not try to bypass the time of mourning. This concludes the Union Gospel Press version of the Sunday School lesson. Comment, rate, share, and subscribe.